Hey, so a quick admin note for this week. I'm going to sound a little bit different for the next 30 minutes because I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Italy as opposed to where I normally record this show back in the state of Georgia. I had the chance to come forward to Europe as part of my day job and I honestly couldn't say no. Anyways, on my off time over here, I've had the opportunity to go to a bunch of different sites that have a lot of relevance to what we've been talking about inside of the first 5 episodes of T&M. I've gone to the mausoleum of King Theoderic and also the Arian Baptistry, one of the last Arian Baptistries I even know about in the whole world, over in the city of Ravenna in Italy. And I've also had the chance to go to the Brera Art Museum, which Napoleon went ahead and inaugurated back in 1809. I know he's a few steps forward in our history from where we're at now, but it will get there eventually, 5-6 years from now. But yeah, no, absolutely. If you want to go see the photos of what I've been doing out here, please go to the Instagram account for Thugs and Miracles. I am at Thugs and Miracles on Instagram. If you're part of that community, by all means, follow us and we'll go ahead and we can continue the conversation on that site. Also, before we get going with the episode today, I want to say a very special thank you to Jamie, Trevor, and Brent. Had some really positive feedback from all 3 of you so far about wanting more episodes and wanting more of this. I really hope to go ahead and be able to accommodate you. Sorry that I can't be as quick as you might want, but hey, again, day jobs, they pay for me to go to Europe. So I'm going to go and do what I have to do. But by all means, I want to go ahead and continue this. So I'm going to go ahead and get off this admin note and start right now. Sieges were the worst, and Clovis hated them with a passion. Yet, here he was, sitting in the shadow of Avignon's city walls, waiting for his rival, Gundobad, to simply decide that he had lost the war and come outside to take his medicine. But, as the seasons were getting ready to turn for a third time, and the wind and rain in the south of France got that much colder, it was becoming evident to everyone that Gundobad was never going to stick his head out. What was worse, it didn't look like the people of Avignon were going to make him. Sieges were supposed to be affairs that cut off food and water and stimulated outbreaks of disease, all of which ground people down and led them to give in. But for Avignon, it wasn't a picnic in there, but the reports coming to Clovis indicated that food supplies were still high, the wells still had clean water, and sickness was no better or worse than it ever was. Clovis was turning out to be just as bad at a siege as his father Childeric had been when he spent years trying to get Paris to fall into his hands. In that case, a local nun, Genevieve, had managed to make supply runs up and down the Seine, laying waste to Childeric's plans. Now there was no nun, just high walls with no apparent weaknesses in a city with unimaginably large stores of food. Clovis started to think he might have to have an army camp out here for years. And where was Godegeisel? Clovis and Godegeisel had partnered up half a year earlier to push Godegeisel's brother Gundobad off of his throne in Burgundy, the region of southeastern Gaul nearest to Italy. Between the two brothers, Clovis actually had more respect for Gundobad, but that was part of why he sided with Godegeisel. Once the stronger brother was gone, Clovis could lean on the weaker one, and perhaps turn him into a vassal so weak that Clovis wouldn't have to waste time later on taking Burgundy by force. The other reason he sided with Godegeisel is because Gundobad, the uncle of his wife Clotilde, had at one point viciously murdered her parents and sent her sister into a convent. So there was that. Anyways, Clovis's plan had gone well at first. He interceded in Burgundy's civil war on behalf of Godegeisel, and between their two armies, they quickly laid waste to Gundobad's forces. Unfortunately, they hadn't actually caught Gundobad. The weasel had run off before the fighting ended, leaving Clovis to run after him. They ran right to Avignon, and that's where the two men found themselves now in this early fall of the year 500. Godegeisel, on the other hand, had watched Clovis run after his brother and, figuring there was no need for both of them to sit in a siege, had decided to clean up back closer to home and set up his new court in the prized city of Vienne. Clovis could picture him there now, sitting in a warm room on plush cushions, while he sat out here in a tent, waiting. And for Clovis, the waiting was the hardest part. He was used to action, to running from battle to battle and constantly killing his enemies and expanding his borders. If he wasn't on campaign, he was working with his lieutenants to plan the next campaign. He didn't sit, and he certainly wasn't made to wait as the errand boy of some puny king he intended to turn into his vassal in short order. He needed to do something. He was done with this silly game. He made up his mind and called together a group of men to go to Gundobad as an embassy. They made the Burgundian an offer that, in exchange for his life, his freedom, and the lifting of the siege, he should send Clovis tribute and then continue these payments annually. Gundobad, almost unbelieving that he was going to make it out of Avignon alive, agreed at once. The next morning, peering over the walls, Gundobad saw that the fields around Avignon were empty, and Clovis had been good to his word. He'd gone home to the north, leaving the way to the east open for Gundobad to reclaim the land that he had lost. He started picking up the pieces of his shattered forces at that very moment, planning the campaign against his brother to begin as early as possible. Go-to-Geisel had to die. This is Thugs and Miracles. Episode 6. Clovis, the First King. Consolidation. Alright, welcome back to episode 6 of T&M. As always, I'm Benjamin Bernier, and this week we're supposed to be on the third episode of a 3-part series looking at the history of Clovis. But, to be honest, as I've done more research and gone further into the subject, I don't really think I can fit everything that's left to say about him into just one episode. For what it's worth, I might not be able to do it in just 2. So, anyway, the current plan is to scrap the trilogy and move on to a tetralogy, think that's the right verbiage, and then go from there. Believe me, there's so much murder, war, and duplicity, not to mention statecraft, shifting alliances, and, oh yeah, the selection of Paris as the capital city of this new quote-unquote land of the Franks, aka Francia, that I truly believe everyone involved, including myself, will be happier and better served to try to not squeeze too much into too little time. And, as I've said before, we're podcasting here, and we make up the rules. So, let's do this. So, normally I begin the show by giving you a story that was written by Gregory of Tours, or Fredegar, or whoever, and then break down where the story came from, why it was written, and more often than not, why that story was patently false. Today, I started differently by instead presenting a story based on various facts we know about Clovis's campaign in the south against his wife's uncle Gundobad. You see, everything I said is generally agreed to have happened. Clovis did go to war with Gundobad, partnering with the latter's brother, Go-to-Geisel, to kick him out of Burgundy. Clovis and Go-to-Geisel were successful, and Clovis did in fact follow Gundobad to Avignon and lay siege to the city, while Go-to-Geisel fell back to Vienne, the town just south of Lyon, not Vienna in Austria. Well, Go-to-Geisel fell back to Vienne to bask in the warm glow of victory. But why did it all happen in the first place? To answer that, we have to understand a little bit more about Gundobad, Go-to-Geisel, Clotilde, and a Burgundian family that rivaled any in Gaul as the quote-unquote most dysfunctional. If you remember way back to episode 4, Clotilde and Clovis were married after the young couple played a series of tricks on Gundobad that basically put this older uncle in a position where he had to bless off on the marriage to avoid losing face. But his relationship with Clotilde went much deeper than just that. Years before, Clotilde had been the daughter of the primary Burgundian king, a man named Chilperic II. I say primary because Chilperic was the oldest of 4 brothers, all of whom ruled over an area of Burgundy. These younger brothers included Gundobad, ruling from Vienne, Go-to-Geisel, ruling from Geneva, and Gundamar, ruling from Lyon. Gundamar exits from history pretty quickly, in 486 to be exact, mainly because he was sitting on an area that Gundobad really liked. So, Gundobad took it, an act that, family ties be damned, cost Gundamar his life. From Gundobad's perspective, this was 1 down, 2 to go. Gundobad next set his sight on Chilperic's realm, centered on the city of Valence. Gundobad rose up and took his shot at the crown in 493, and to make sure he didn't miss, he acted as brutally as possible. Gundobad found his brother and killed him, and then, to make sure there was no one left for the people to sympathize with as possible pretenders to the throne, Gundobad found his sister-in-law, Caratenna, Clotilde's mother, tied a rope around her neck, and then attached the other end to a stone, which he threw into a body of water. Gregory wrote this, and he didn't mention which body of water, but the action left no doubts about the idea of concessions or negotiations. He then turned his eyes towards Chilperic's daughters, and, in this case, he was slightly more lenient. Gundobad forced one of them, a girl named Chroma, into a convent, and he would have done the same or possibly worse to the second, Clotilde, if she hadn't been able to get away to go to Geisel in Geneva before Gundobad got his hands on her. This was the family history that Clotilde undoubtedly held in her heart and which would play into Geisel's hands years later when he decided to square off against his brother in a Highlander-like there can be only one style showdown. The fact that Gundobad actually showed some leniency towards the girls almost cost him his life and his kingdom. On a side note, as a wannabe historian, I try not to make moral judgments about what people did or didn't do throughout history. But it's episodes like this that make you understand a little more why conquerors would be so brutal to those that they had beaten. Mercy has a strange way of popping up throughout history and biting people, and they could never tell who it was going to be that was going to get them. In this case, if Gundobad had simply executed a teenage Clotilde, he might not have had to have dealt with Clovis later. He certainly wasn't above it. I mean, did I mention that he drowned Cartagena with a stone? In 499, Geisel had raised an army to go up against his brother, but he had to have realized that he was in no way certain to win with his current force because he went and petitioned Clovis for his support. Gundobad, also realizing that the ensuing battle would be little better than a coin flip, also petitioned Clovis. Gundobad's claim rested primarily on being the legitimate ruler of Burgundy, a title he had taken through force, strength, and audacity, all traits that Clovis would undoubtedly appreciate. Geisel really only had one argument going for him. He was the uncle who had not brutally murdered or imprisoned Clovis's wife's entire immediate family. Even in the 5th and 6th centuries, when husband-wife relationships were undoubtedly different than what they are today, this latter argument was going to carry the day. And so it was that Clovis rose up with Geisel and drove Gundobad to Avignon. Unfortunately for Geisel, however, the rest of the opening story is also true. Clovis held out a siege for a few months, but eventually gave in when Gundobad's envoys convinced Clovis to relent in exchange for tribute. This situation will work out fine for Clovis, the strong and brutal warlord of the north, but not so much for the much less motivated Geisel. The fact that Gundobad was alive basically ensured that he would be back. And that's what happened. Gundobad took his second chance on life, and according to Gregory, around 501, quote, he regained his power, and now contemptuously refused to pay the promised tribute to King Clovis, and set his army in motion against his brother Geisel, and shut him up in the city of Vienne, and besieged him. And when food began to be lacking for the common people, Geisel was afraid that the famine would extend to himself, and gave orders that the common people be expelled from the city. When this was done, there was driven out, among the rest, the artisan who had charge of the aqueduct. And he was indignant that he had been cast out from the city with the rest, and went to Gundobad in a rage to inform him how to burst into the city and take vengeance upon his brother. Under his guidance, an army was led through the aqueduct, and surprised from the rear the defenders who were shooting arrows from the wall. The trumpet was sounded in the midst of the city, and the besiegers seized the gates, and opened them and entered at the same time. And when the people between these two battle lines were being slain by each army, Geisel sought refuge in the house of the heretics, and was slain there along with the Arian bishop. Finally, the Franks who were with Geisel gathered in a tower. But Gundobad ordered that no harm should be done to a single one of them, but seized them and sent them in exile to King Alaric at Toulouse. End quote. King Alaric II was the king of the Visigoths at this time. You may remember him from episode 4, when Syagrius in 486 had run down to Toulouse to attempt to gain quarter and safe passage from him. Well, Just like in 486, things hadn't changed much with Alaric II, and he was always looking for the diplomatic way out. He handed Syagrius back to Clovis back then, and now, sensing rising tensions with Clovis, and hoping to dissuade yet another incursion by the Franks into Visigothic territory, these Frankish soldiers that had just been handed to him by Gundobad became the set piece around which Alaric called for a meeting with the Frankish king so that the two monarchs could work out their issues and come to an understanding. The gambit worked. Alaric sent an emissary to Clovis, asking to meet on an island in the Loire River. Clovis accepted and the two met. They ate and they drank together, they promised friendship, and they left the island in peace. Clovis got his soldiers back, and he returned north. And the moment he returned, he continued to plot. After his return north from the siege of Avignon in 500-501, Clovis would have been able to survey his kingdom and plan his next moves. In this sense, he was much more like Gundobad. He would never stop moving, never stop looking for the next move, never stop planning and battling to expand his kingdom. He didn't have it in him to settle like Geisel, to go back to a small province and be happy with the many advantages his position had brought him and his family. Besides, Gundobad had seen to it that Geisel didn't get to enjoy anything for too long, a fact that almost certainly served to bolster Clovis's view of himself and of the world. The weak get eaten by the strong, while thugs, men of brute force and action, get to do the eating. At any rate, it was now that Clovis would have been able to look over a map to see just how much he had won. He would have seen a land that stretched exponentially further than anything his predecessors had ever envisioned. Starting from the small northern region of Belgica Secunda, he had systematically pushed outward, taking Syagrius' kingdom in 486, and then turning his sights to the west to defeat the Thuringi in 491. In 496, with God's help, Clovis had subdued the Alemanni, while at the same time in the west, he had secured his flank by allying with the Armoricans, who resided in the area of what's now modern-day Brittany. His kingdom stretched from well beyond the Rhine River in the east, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The sea to the north protected him from invaders, all of which allowed him to focus his efforts on pushing in one direction, the only direction left available: south. But south was one place where Clovis had to admit that he had tasted defeat. Throughout the 490s, he'd been looking at pushing into Aquitaine, the land to the southwest held by King Alaric and his Visigoths. He'd had some success, pushing as far south as Bordeaux and managing to take towns like Poitiers and Tours. But when the Alemanni required Clovis to focus on the eastern part of the empire, he was forced to cede the land he had taken from the Visigoths. He just did not have the forces available to hold the areas he had taken so deep in enemy territory and fight for more on the opposite side of the kingdom simultaneously. Now to move south, Clovis would have to overcome these two powerful enemies along his southern border, both with reasons to mistrust and dislike Clovis. On top of that, Alaric was tied to a third king, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who, in 493, had been able to kill Odoacer, who, in turn, had deposed Romulus Augustus and brought an end to the Western Roman Empire in 476. Theodoric crowned himself as King of Italy and was interested in reconstituting the Western Roman Empire as a Gothic empire. He wasn't going to stand idly by if the Franks went to war with the Visigoths. As a final bit of intrigue, Theodoric had been particularly crafty in the use of marriage alliances. He'd married Clovis' sister, Autofleda, and had married off his children to various power players across the remnants of the Western Empire. He, like Clovis, was smart enough to realize that there were times when diplomacy could get a king far more than a battle could. Unfortunately for Theodoric, Autofleda had died back in 501, so his diplomatic ties to the Frankish king were not as strong as they had been. With all these machinations going on in the south, Clovis had been just as busy in the north. He'd recently received a delegation from the Byzantine Empire representing Emperor Anastasius himself. The emperor had deep pockets, well deeper than Alaric's and anything that had been promised on that island in the Loire, and he was able to make Clovis an offer he couldn't refuse. By 507, with dreams of further conquest dancing in his mind and the support of the Eastern Roman Emperor, from here on in referred to exclusively as the Byzantine Emperor. Filling his sails, Clovis sent out the call to mobilize the army. The Franks were headed to war. And it was here again that we can see Clovis's decision to convert to Catholicism coming back to serve him. According to Danuta Schanzer, quote, "The long-term success of the Franks and the survival of Francia have often been ascribed to Clovis's decision to be baptized as a Nicene Christian. His choice, so it goes, removed a barrier between himself and his own Roman subjects, and allowed him to drive wedges between rival Arian kings and their Roman subjects, permitted him to harness the power of the Nicene Church, and enabled him more easily to be recognized by Emperor Anastasius in Constantinople." End quote. In other words, being a Catholic tied Clovis into a world of power, resources, and manpower/popular support that his rival kings could not touch. It also made him the rightful ruler in the eyes of many people living inside of the territories of the Arian kings, setting in place a fifth column of sorts. If they weren't active in their dissension to the Arian kings, being forced to choose between their monarch and their god would certainly have diminished the fervor of so many would-be soldiers. Anyway, we have Clovis crossing the threshold and entering into Gothic territory, getting as far as the city of Vouillé. Now, how does everyone react to this? Well, Alaric gets his army together and heads up to face the threat. Gundobad, politician to the end, chooses to get his army together, then wait to see how things play out. And Theodoric, the powerful king of Italy, also got his army ready to fight, but was then sidetracked by a coastal attack from the Byzantines. This latter attack was almost certainly nothing more than a feint, but it had the intended effect of fixing Theodoric in place in Italy long enough for Clovis to go to war against a single, unreinforced enemy. Procopius of Caesarea takes the narrative from here, beginning with Alaric learning of Clovis's move south. Quote, "When Alaric learned this, he summoned Theodoric as quickly as possible, and he set out to his assistance with a great army. In the meantime, the Visigoths, upon learning that the Germans were encamped near the city of Carcassiana, went to meet them, and making a camp, remained quiet. But since much time was being spent by them in blocking the enemy in this way, they began to be vexed, and seeing that their land was being plundered by the enemy, they became indignant, and at length they began to heap many insults upon Alaric, reviling him on account of his fear of the enemy, and taunting him with the delay of his father-in-law. For they declared that they by themselves were a match for the enemy in battle, and that even though unaided, they would easily overcome the Germans in the war. For this reason, Alaric was compelled to do battle with the enemy before the Goths had as yet arrived. And the Germans, gaining the upper hand in this engagement, killed the most of the Visigoths and their ruler, Alaric. Then they took possession of the greater part of Gaul and held it. And they laid siege to Carcassiana with great enthusiasm, because they had learned that the royal treasure was there, which Alaric the Elder, in earlier times, had taken as booty when he captured Rome." End quote. So, yeah, take this as further proof that listening to your boys when they're taunting you is not always sound strategy. In Alaric's defense, he was between a rock and a hard place. If he sat and continued to do nothing, he's likely to face a mutiny, so he took his shot with, and Rumsfeld would love this, with the army he had, not the one that he wanted. And in the end it ended poorly. Some accounts go so far as to say Clovis and Alaric met on the field of battle in single combat, with the former stabbing the latter in the face. There's even paintings of the event depicting exactly that, but all of these accounts and drawings came about hundreds of years after the event, so take the notion of a grand and gallant Game of Thrones style sword fight with a grain of salt. What we can surmise happened is that Clovis destroyed Alaric and his forces relatively easily and pushed on toward the Mediterranean. Gundobad, seeing how his now good friend Clovis had won at Vouillé, jumped into the battle at this point and laid siege to Arles. However, Theodoric was finally able to get his army into Gaul to mount a counteroffensive, and was able to keep a narrow band in the Septimania region of far southern Gaul under the control of the Goths. This might not sound like much, but this thin strip of land served three huge purposes. First, it kept the Goths physically connected and prevented the Franks and the Burgundians from applying a divide and conquer strategy. Second, It kept a landline of communication available for the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths to maintain movement for years to come, well after the Visigoths had fled to the safety of Hispania in modern-day Spain. And finally, this narrow strip of land prevented Clovis from establishing a beachhead that would have allowed his Byzantine friends to join the fight in earnest. Honestly, and this is just my opinion here, but this action alone probably changed the complexion of the European world for centuries to come. So at this point, we can start to see the full extent of Clovis's campaigns coming into clear focus. With the addition of Aquitaine, Clovis was now fully uncontested all the way down to the Pyrenees. Gundobad remained on the Burgundian throne, but after having been beaten down by Theodoric for their part in besieging Arles, Burgundy wasn't an immediate threat to Clovis. And speaking of Theodoric, there's almost no doubt that he would have loved to have campaigned in the west, but he was smart enough to realize that if he did that, he would completely expose his eastern flank, and it just wasn't a long enough march between Constantinople and Ravenna for him to feel comfortable pulling his armies away from his stronghold. And so now here we are, in the year 508. Clovis has pushed the Visigoths over the mountains. He's effectively in control of most of what had been Roman Gaul, and after all of these battles, he has more land and more booty than he knows what to do with. He finally seems to have it all, when Emperor Anastasius came sweeping in to add the cherry to the top of the imperial sundae. From Gregory, quote, Clovis received an appointment to the consulship from the Emperor Anastasius, and in the church of the Blessed Martin he clad himself in the purple tunic and chalmis, and placed a diadem on his head. Then he mounted his horse, and in the most generous manner he gave gold and silver as he passed along the way which is between the gate of the entrance of the church of St. Martin and the church of the city, scattering it among the people who were there with his own hand. And from that day he was called Consul or Augustus. Leaving Tours, he went to Paris, and there he established the seat of his kingdom. End quote. For a guy who had lived his entire life in the shadow of the Roman Empire, this was the peak. Now that he had a proper kingdom and the recognition of the emperor as a consul of Rome, it was time for Clovis to rule what he had earned. And he chose to do so from Paris, which is a sight that seems obvious to us now, but was likely not so clear a choice early in the 6th century. So let's take a quick look at the history of Paris to see if we can understand a little better why Clovis thought that this was the best place from which to headquarter his kingdom. Going way back, the city was occupied from around the middle of the 3rd century BC by a sub-tribe of the Celtic Senones known as the Parisii. It became a hub for trade due to its location along the Seine, and was captured by the Romans in 52 BC. They called the town Lutetia, or more fully, Lutetia Parisorium, or Lutetia the Parisii. It became a prosperous city with a forum, baths, temples, theaters, and an amphitheater. By the end of the Western Roman Empire, the town was simply known as Parisius, and over time it would shorten even further to the Paris that we know today. Due to its wealth and the strategic location of the city, it became a target for raiding by barbarians in the 3rd century, which led the inhabitants to build walls to fortify the area. The material of those ancient monuments I just mentioned, especially the amphitheater, were used to erect the walls. The new center of the city was comprised of at least 4 monuments also erected in the 4th century: the Basilica, the Palais, 1 Roman Thermae, and the Cathedral. Of these, we're going to focus on the Palais and the Cathedral, as these 2 buildings have the most relevance to our story. The Palais was probably a military construction, and it was presumably used as an imperial residence by the Roman emperors Julian and Valentinian I between 364 and 375 AD, while they lived in the city. This tie to relatively recent Roman emperors would certainly have made Paris more appealing to Clovis, a strong ruler in his own right, who was tied to the Byzantines and who would gladly use the symbolism of these past emperors to strengthen and polish his own claim to the throne. The second monument was the cathedral. This building, according to written and archaeological evidence, was likely built in the 4th century. It was constructed similar to a Roman basilica and was considered the first church of Paris. What's particularly interesting, to me anyway, is that this church existed at the same time in the city as the Roman Thermae. This shows that there were no abrupt ruptures between the Gallo-Roman city and the Christian city, but instead, the changes in the habits were very, very gradual. The inhabitants of Paris probably continued to go to the Thermae to worship Roman gods, while at the same time they would have attended the cathedral to participate in the rituals associated with Christianity. In the next several centuries, the Roman monuments and gods would fade in influence and eventually disappear, as more Christian buildings were built and more festivals associated with different saints took place in the city. However, the cathedral would remain important through all of this. Despite the local importance of having served as a residence to Emperors Julian and Valentinian, Paris in 508 was still not one of the most important cities in Gaul. Paris was overshadowed by cities such as Tours and Rouen, and was honestly so small from the point of view of strategic importance that Attila failed to lay waste to it when he campaigned through Gaul in 450 and 451. Fans of St. Genevieve like to say this was because she led a prayer group that brought God's favor down upon the town and caused Attila to rampage elsewhere. Not to be overly skeptical, but Attila probably passed on the town because it wouldn't have been worth the time and manpower needed to take it. In other words, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. At any rate, Clovis, who was originally from nearby Tournai, likely chose the town for multiple reasons. It was far enough north to keep him near to where he had started, but far enough south that he still was relatively centrally located. Paris also likely held some amount of personal importance for him, as his dad Childeric had spent years trying to take it, and now it was his. Plus, he would have known of the Roman emperors living there. He was a Roman consul now, by order of the Byzantine Emperor, and he would want to draw on this history. No record remains as to which of these items, or if any of them, was the main rationale for choosing Paris, but ultimately it was his choice, and the rest, as they say, is history. Alright, so we can now say that we've looked at exactly how Clovis, a 15-year-old orphan living in upstate Gaul, was able to parlay the inheritance left to him by Childeric into a kingdom that, 27 years later, by 508, was starting to look a whole lot like the country of France we know today. We understand why he may have selected Paris for his capital city, and we also have seen the ongoing importance of his conversion to Catholicism in helping to win over the people and the Byzantine Emperor alike. Next time, however, we're going to focus on those people I just mentioned. We've spent a lot of time discussing kings and capitals and wars and diplomacy, but we haven't stepped back to understand what the world of the early 6th century probably looked like to a common person. Luckily, I had the good fortune to have corresponded recently with David Powell, an alumnus of Villanova University who spent his graduate studies focused on the evolution of late antique and early medieval urban and suburban Western Europe, and in particular Gaul. One of his papers, The Peasant Rusticus, Life Near Paris in the Time of Clovis, does an outstanding job of laying out what this period of time must have felt like for the common person, from the point of view of a common man, doing his best to work and live to get along. Then, after that episode, we're going to come back to Clovis for one last look at what he accomplished in his last 3 years of life and the legacy he left for his 4 sons. It should be fun. There's treachery, deceit, and at least one more guy getting his head laid open with an axe. In other words, it has all of the things we love to talk about with these times. Additionally, we're going to carve out an ample amount of time to talk about Clotilde and St. Genevieve. These amazing women had tremendous impacts upon this time, but too often they've been overlooked by men writing about other men in history. We're going to do our small part here at T&M to try to rectify this issue. We're going to look at how these women were able to go ahead and exercise their influence and assert themselves in a time and a society that was largely patriarchal. It's an incredible story, and it's definitely worth telling. Clotilde lived for another 34 years after the death of her husband Clovis, and arguably had more influence over the ultimate direction of Francia than Clovis ever had. Genevieve became known as the patron saint of Paris and is still considered such to this day. Both women were eventually accorded sainthood by the Roman Catholic Church, a distinction that the new Constantine, Clovis, never received himself. Before we go, as always, the music used for the show comes from Josh Woodward and includes his songs Bully and Lafayette. For a free download of these songs, or hundreds of other great tracks, check out his site at joshwoodward.com. Notes on this episode and a list of sources is available online at thugsandmiracles.com. Please leave a comment. You can email me at thugsandmiracles@gmail.com, and you can also hit me on Twitter at thugsandmiracle, or leave a comment on Facebook at facebook.com/thugsandmiracles. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, TNM now has its own Instagram page, at Thugs and Miracles. So go check out that site, follow us, check out the pictures, and continue the conversation on anything you want to talk about, whether it's France, Italy, or anything that has to do with medieval European history. We're happy to engage. Finally, if you've enjoyed the show and you have a moment, I ask you to please leave a review on whichever platform you get your podcasts. This helps get the podcast out to more people. If you feel the show's worth 5 stars, I'll be forever in your debt if you go ahead and take the time to put that online. Once again, my name is Benjamin Bernier, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks with the next episode of Thugs and Miracles.